But we kind of experience these moments where we change as people and we revisit who we are. And the bardo is that place where we enter, where we get to choose, what of my past no longer serves me? What of my past can I let go? Can I just let be? And what of my old self do I want to bring with me as I kind of evolve into into who I'm becoming?
Hello, and welcome to the Conspiracy of Goodness podcast, where you'll have no end to aha moments about things that are possible in the future for you. There is an enormous wave of goodness and progress happening in the world all over the place. Millions of people want a better world, and they're doing this thing and that to make it happen, large and small. And we're here to shine a light on some of the people in that wave who are doing things that break all the mold and make new inroads for others. And one of the things that we found that's really interesting about change makers and thought leaders who are so committed to a brighter future is that they think a brighter future is possible, despite all the mayhem and craziness that we see on social media and the news. And that's what we're here to do. We're here to talk to these folks about why they think the future's bright, hear their stories, get their insights, know how to turn setbacks into opportunity like they do, because that's the number one thing I've noticed. I've been curating the internet at the Goodness Exchange with a wonderful team and shining a light on what we call a conspiracy of goodness of our times. And what we see there, a thread that runs through all the thought leaders making the world a better place, is that they just have a way of looking at one setback after another and turning it into the opportunity. And that is something that is a shining quality of today's guest. Today, we're going to meet Mike Schauch. He's a mountaineer and an entrepreneur and an award-winning author who lives to explore places remote all around the world. And it's very obvious that what he also lives to do is shine a light on human connection and the beauty he's discovering along the way. When I had a brief conversation with Mike recently, I learned that he was super fortunate as a young person to be a really, really good entrepreneur. And he's taken all that good fortune and he's used it ever since to live an amazing altruistic life. And he sees good everywhere and is using his good fortune to be a multiplier for what's good and progress in the world. So the cool thing about Mike's story is that in 2012, as a mountaineer, he and his wife Chantel undertook an expedition to a really remote valley in the Himalayas in northern Nepal, and something went way wrong. It unfolded in sort of one of those one thing after another negative ways. And in the end, he and Chantel had an experience that changed the trajectory of their life entirely. And I would argue that most of us have those opportunities if we can only learn to recognize them. So Mike has a book called A Story of Karma, Finding Love and Truth in the Lost Valley in the Himalayas. There's actually a valley that was called the Lost Valley. So we're going to have an enjoyable conversation here where he's going to reveal sort of one thing after another that he has learned the hard way in celebrating setbacks as the opportunities they create. So thank you, Mike, for joining us on the Conspiracy of Goodness podcast.
Thank you, Linda, for having me. It's awesome to be here.
Well, I tell you, we're definitely going to get to the story of this little girl named Karma and all that you have learned along the way since that relationship started. But what I really want to start with is this uncanny sort of story about how everything went wrong that led you to so many right things in your life.
Right. Yeah. No, I mean, I guess there's a few, sort of defining moments or milestone events in our lives, or in my life. But one, of course, that we're talking about here is I had this dream to go to the Himalaya. This was back in 2011. We were planning it. But ever since I was a child, I wanted to go to the Himalaya and climb a mountain there. And it was kind of this dream that I held on to. It became part of my identity, essentially. It's, when sometimes you have such a strong feeling about something and it becomes part of you, even, you think that that's your destiny, right? And so that's kind of the mentality that my wife Chantel and we put together a small team, and we went into this little valley called, as you say, the Lost Valley of the Himalaya. And it was a valley that had only been recently opened a few years before we went in there. Prior to that, it had been closed off totally to the outside world. And it took several days to get in there of trekking and over these high mountain passes. And I had this photograph of this pyramidal peak that I was looking to climb. And we found it. And when we found it, that's when everything started unraveling and falling apart. And I was caught in a snowstorm at 17,000 feet. And the mule that was carrying my climbing gear, ran away on me. And so all of these things started kind of, sort of started forcing me to question, why was I there? It forced me to hunker down in this little remote outpost village and kind of forced me to ask the questions. What was I doing there? Why was I there? Because I could no longer climb this mountain. And I found myself in this sort of Jekyll and Hyde like conversation with myself, where there was the mountain, or my inability to climb the mountain left this gap. And in that gap was this suffering, right? And so I was trying to kind of find my way through that gap and through that suffering. And that's kind of where things took a turn, an unexpected turn.
So this is what you just said, this gap. This is something we have all lived with over and over and over through the pandemic, if we weren't living it plenty too often before, right? Talk to us about that.
Yeah, well, I think we all tend to do it. We kind of, as we're growing up, we have these values that we get, whether they're from our parents or from our just our upbringing or from our environments that we're in, and we get to sort of become these, those values help shape who we are, right? And then we get to a certain point in life where maybe something we thought was going to happen or something in line with our values, reality is different. And it's in those moments where I think, they're the hardest moments, right? Because that's what sort of shakes our world, right? So to speak. But it also is the greatest opportunity to look at, who we are, and hey, that thing that we were so attached to, does that really matter in terms of where I'm going? In fact, there's a brilliant Tibetan word called the bardo. And the bardo it means place of transition, a transitionary state between death and between rebirth. And, we think about reincarnation, or the Western sense is reincarnation from lifetime to lifetime. But the Tibetans actually believe that we can experience many incarnations across one lifetime. And think about, we're not the same person we were when we were born, or even from 10 years ago, or 5 years ago, or maybe even last week. But so when we kind of experience these sort of significant character changes, it doesn't always have to be something, totally like an upheaval in our life, but we kind of experience these moments where we change as people and we revisit who we are. And the bardo is that place where we enter, where we get to choose, what of my past no longer serves me? What of my past can I let go? Can I just let be? And what of my old self do I want to bring with me as I kind of evolve into who I'm becoming? So that stage of again, rebirth, I'm using that word, but it can be a very turbulent time, but it's also a brilliant opportunity to see the depth of what is possible.
That is such a great point. It's all about self-awareness, isn't it? It's like being able to pause and, become the observer. Talk to me about that. Talk to me about that stage, because there's some great stories in your journey about then pausing long enough in your sort of suffering to lift your head and start seeing all kinds of things that you otherwise wouldn't have seen.
Yeah, no, and that's a great point, because it's when we're in those moments of chaos that we start noticing things that we wouldn't have noticed before. And so, for example, when I was out there in the middle of the Himalaya, this village is at 14,000 feet in elevation, way off the beaten path. And so I was there for several days, and I ended up meeting this young man who had just come back to the same village. He left that village when he was 14 years old. He went all the way down to India. That's where he had to go to get an education outside of his village. So, and he had just come back 7 years later. He hadn't seen his village. He hadn't seen his home, his family in 7 years. And our paths happened to cross exactly just at that time. And so because I was hunkering down there, him and we started taking these daily walks together. And his name was Sonam Dorje. And Sonam Dorje would kind of share with me about the plight of his village, the village, the plight of the people, and shared with me about the culture there and Tibetan Buddhism and all of that. And one day I remember we took this walk up to this hilltop monastery, which is just sort of north of the village there. And we were kind of overlooking the whole valley. It was just a gorgeous, absolutely, breathtaking scene. And, these 7,000-meter peaks in front of you and this little cluster of buildings hanging on for dear life, almost like the mountains are squishing the life out of the place. But we were looking over the whole place. And I asked Sanam Dorje about this mantra, because everywhere, anyone who's been to the Himalaya or that part of the Himalaya will see this mantra, Om Mani Padme Hum. It's painted all over the rocks, the prayer stones, the flags, everything. And so I asked Sanam about this. I said, what is this meaning of Om Mani Padme Hum? Because up until that point, nobody could kind of, reveal the depth of what it meant. And so, Sanam, he pondered for a little while, and then he said, well, it's a blessing. It's a blessing. We bless, whether it's the sick or the healthy, life or death, struggle, everything in between, we bless it because that suffering is our karma. And our karma is our life. And that suffering allows us to expand into our destiny, right? Into our life. So I never heard of suffering talked about in that way before. And it just kind of got me thinking, well, okay, if this indeed is my karma, then where is this ultimately leading me? And that's kind of what allowed me to let the mountain go, let that part of my identity, and just sort of move forward into not knowing where. It was like a river, right? It's flowing. I know it's flowing in a direction. I don't know what's going to be around that bend, but I'm just going to trust in this process and trust in where it's guiding me right now.
That's kind of the gist of struggle, isn't it? Like, none of us look for excuses to get out of our comfort zone. At least I don't know that many people who really pursue their growing edges with like zeal. But that's that's a nicer way to say it. Yeah. Growing edges. But that's what it is, right? Like way out there where we're least comfortable or most unhappy or most disappointed or most hurt, right? We don't go and pursue those places. But so tell us about karma.
Yeah,
not the process of karma, but whatever you want to call it. The lovely little person karma.
Yeah, well, it's a long story, but I'll try and, kind of give a brief glimpse into it. So as a result of not climbing that mountain, we kind of went to this other little nearby village. It was still a 2-day trek from where we were, but I would not have gone there had I climbed the mountain. And everything that I learned from Sanam Dorje about education and how difficult it was for kids there to get education, the struggle, what happens, because again, it's a totally different way of life out there. It's changing now. Like it's different now. This is 10 years later than, back then. But at that time, especially, girls were still getting married at 14, 15 years old, starting their own families. At that time, there was no access to electricity. There was no access to toilets, just healthcare, educate, all of that stuff, right? They're out there on their own and they're semi-nomadic. They have to move with the seasons. So a very tough way of life. And so when we went to this other little village, one of the first things we saw was this little stone school. And we get to this little stone school and there's a little girl, a 7-year-old girl, teaching English numbers to this group of kids. And we're just thinking, well, what is happening here? Why is she teaching English numbers? And so we're kind of hanging out there, observing for a while. And we found the real teacher and he was kind of sent there from a totally different part of Nepal, 2 weeks away from his family and his home. So he told us he had felt like he'd been banished to the end of the earth kind of thing. No desire to really be there. But anyway, this little girl, she had so much confidence in the numbers and just sort of the passion for education was coming through, right? And then we could see that some of the kids were, one of our friends who was with us, his name is Michael as well, but he had his guitar slung over his shoulder. And we could see that the kids, they had never seen a guitar or heard a guitar at that point. So you could see that they were kind of interested in that. And so we said, hey, can we teach them some music? And the teacher said, yeah, for sure. So Michael went up to the front of the class, started teaching the kids this jazzed up rendition of Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. And the kids were getting right into it. I thought, how are they going to get through all these melodic twists? But they were right there. And I guess that kind of motivated this teacher. And he brought out this Nepali drum and started, what he wanted to do was he wanted the kids to dance one at a time in front of us. And he started with this little girl who was so confident in her teaching ability. He just kind of put her on the spot and he told her, just like dance, and she didn't dance. She was standing there. She was kind of petrified. She looked scared. She didn't know what was going on. She almost, you could see her starting to internally cry. And we're just like, okay, this is awkward. And so Chantal couldn't take it. And she just marched right up there next to this little girl and started doing her best impression of this Nepali dance. I mean, Chantal doesn't know how to do traditional Nepali dance, but she was up there waving her arms, and this little girl kind of forgot about everybody and everybody watching and just tried to imitate Chantal's improvised moves. And the two of them, they had this special sort of moment together where they were just sort of in their own world, the two of them, just kind of reveling in each other's presence. And that's kind of the spark that sort of opened up this whole new journey for me and Chantal, and the little girl's name is Karma, we found out, and her family, and just over the next 10 years, that followed.
So you ended up getting as far as meeting her parents and getting to go home with her, and so pick it up there.
Yeah. So we were, after that moment, I mean, here's the interesting thing about life, right? I mean, we could have just had that moment and been like, okay, that was beautiful. And then we could have all gone on our separate ways, right? But something was pulling us back together. None of us, just left it at that. And for example, after school, Karma found where we were staying with her friends, and her friends came running in. Karma gave like Chantal the biggest heart-to-heart hug. Chantal told me afterwards that this was the biggest hug she'd ever received from a child. And then Karma, she leaped into my arms. Just like, I'll never forget her little hands, grabbing the back of my neck. And it was kind of like, in that moment, it was kind of clear to me, this is why I'm not climbing the mountain, in that half a second moment. And then her friends kind of came rushing in, and they were, they learned some English words at that point. They were asking us for chocolate and candy, and we didn't have any. But when they were done, Karma came back and she just pulled out of her sweater this little laminate card with English and Nepali words on it. And she just kind of motioned to Chantal, can you speak the words, the English words? And that's when it really sort of dawned, on Chantal and me, like, okay, this little girl, materially, they have very little up there. As I said, it's pure survival. And she doesn't want any chocolate. She doesn't want any of that. She just wants to learn. So that's when we started asking the questions, well, what happens to these kids, up here in these villages? How can they get access to outside education? Everything that I learned from Sanam Dorje about, the plight of the kids and the education and how far he had to go, so we thought, okay, well, we should meet her family. We should just have a conversation and sit down and just sort of find out, what are their thoughts about her future. And so we did that. We found their little home, and this is stone home, one main room with a dung-fueled stove in the middle, and everything happens around that stove. And it was just it was one of the most beautiful experiences of my life. I mean, her father's a yak herder, and he was still out, a couple days away with the yaks, and her mother was working long hours, probably 12 hours in the field, so she was still out. But Karma, she brought us into her home by the hand, got the fire going, got the sort of the tea kettle with the water, put out the mats for us to sit on, and all the while taking care of her 3-year-old sister, Pemba. And I just thought, where else in the world would this, certainly not in North America, would you have this happen? So, it was a very magical experience. And then her mom came home, just very beautiful, very graceful woman, hard, you could see like weathered by the elements and all of that, but just tried to be there for us, making tea, making these little snacks. And then we had this broken conversation. It was all through broken conversation, because even our Sherpa, we were with these Sherpa guides, but they spoke a different dialect than them. So, but what we learned, which was the most important thing for us to discover, was that education to them for their girls is the biggest blessing that they could ever hope for and ask for. And so we thought, okay, well, as long as Karma would like education, why don't we work together? Why don't we, the four of us, kind of come together and do what we can, for their girls, right? Or for Karma at that stage, and then Pemba came on afterwards. But that's kind of, sort of what happened there in terms of how that all started evolving.
That's such a great example of, we don't have to make a touchdown for others. I think it's hard. Sometimes it's hard to commit to a new path like you're talking about, where you're starting to do what you can do to improve the life of another person because you think that it's too big, you can't make a difference, or that you've got too many other things. But I'm sure you went into this with some notion about scale that was probably, well, we'll do what we can do. But tell us where you ended up with these guys.
Well, that was the thing. We kind of, we knew enough to know that, okay, well, this, whatever school Karma goes into, has to be culturally aligned with her, right? Because they're actually in the mountains out there, they're more Tibetan ethnicity. They're actually considered indigenous for that part of the world. And most of Nepal is actually Hindu, right? Kind of a heavy influence from the south, from India. So very much on the caste system. And so we knew that, if Karma were to come down for education into some sort of a government school, there could be rise for, well, first of all, it would kind of be out of her cultural, heritage. But second of all, there could be rise for racial discrimination, being on the caste there. So being on the low end of the caste.
Because you're talking about like a boarding school where she
would have to go. Yeah, because that's essentially what we learned was kids would have to leave their villages because there's no access. Again, these villages are just way too far out there. Yeah. Most of the time, a lot of the mountain passes are cut off because of the storms or the weather, or mudslides. So it's just to set up a school in those places is just very difficult. Yeah. So anyway, we thought, okay, well, let's see what we could find. And we went back to Kathmandu and we spent days searching around, couldn't find anything. We came back to Canada and searched for 3 or 4 weeks. We were looking around and you couldn't find anything still. We were almost, kind of losing hope in a way. And then I remember one night, Chantal, up popped on her screen this school called Sri Mangaljip SMD School for Himalayan Children, actually said for the lost children of the Himalaya. And we thought, okay. And the pictures on the front page were like the villages that we were in there, where Karma's from. And we thought, okay, who founded this school? And so it was founded by this Tibetan Lama who left Tibet back in the, after 59 there. And we thought, okay, this looks perfect for Karma. So we wrote the school at once. And, a few days went by, the school director wrote back and she said, thank you for sharing this. And it sounds like a beautiful little girl and all of that. But she said, I have to tell you that our school is full. We're full capacity. We've got 400 kids. We've got 500 kids at the school. We've got 400 kids on the waiting list. We've got kids being dropped off on the stairs that have to be turned away. And because of all that, there's only one person who can admit kids into the school. And that is this 80-plus-year-old Tibetan Lama. And so, it's one of those moments where you're reading the email and it's like, it just feels like I was being dropped down some sort of black hole. Why are there so many barriers stacked against one little girl? I mean, we think about education here, right? In our countries and in any sort of first world country. And it's kind of almost like a given, right? There's, we have little pockets here and there where it's challenging, but for the most part, it's kind of, we take it for granted almost. Whereas a little girl out there in the mountains, I was thinking, why is it so hard, for her to get access? But Chantal had included our address in her email signature. And the school director said, oh, I see that you're in Canada, in Vancouver. You may be interested to know that this Dharanguru Rinpoche, this 80-plus-year-old Lama, happens to be at his monastery right now in a place called Richmond, which was like a 15, 20-minute drive from our home. And I just thought, what? Okay, the whole journey just brought us right back to where we started. So, so long story short, we were able to meet with him. And then, he decided to admit Karma into the school.
And then, you've gone on this amazing journey since then, sort of co-parenting Karma and then Pemba, her little sister. This is the kind of change that over the scope of time can change the future for thousands of people when you think about the one shift.
Right. And I think that's something that, it's funny, you never really know, right? You never really know how it's going to change things, like the impact of our actions. I mean, it's impossible to know. And that's why I think we just have to kind of do what we think is the right way and just trust in that, right? I mean, to try and create the maximum impact, you might think, well, instead of focusing on one little girl and maybe focus on, 100 or 1,000. But it's just like, well, I mean, first of all, we're not doing it because of that. We're not trying to, this is not like some sort of social impact project. This is a connection of love and family and all of that. So So it's not really about impact from that perspective. But you're right. It's like, you just, we'll never know. Karma and her sister Pemba, how that's changed the trajectory of their lives, how it's changed the trajectory of our lives, all the people that they've touched over the years and will continue to affect, we just have no idea where that's going to go. But that's the beautiful thing about it too, right? That's the beautiful thing about life. We just don't know how one small connection can spark, what's the saying? It takes a snowflake to start an avalanche. So, you just never know.
Okay, so we're going to take a quick break. And when we come back, well, during the break, I'm going to talk to you about a wonderful opportunity that we've created for people to discover more like the stories that you're talking about, Mike. Let's take a break. And when we come back, we'll learn more about how it is that we know the right decision. What's the best course? Because these are the kind of opportunities that face us every day. And it's so easy to say, oh, I can't get involved. But when we come back, we'll work on that together. Thanks. Dr. Linda here. If you are hoping the world is a lot better than what we see on the news and social media, and if you've been overwhelmed by the misery and negativity coming from the screens in your life, I've got a wonderful connection for you. What I've learned after almost a decade of curating the internet for insight and innovation is that there is an enormous wave of goodness and progress well underway in the world that almost no one knows about yet. And that's what led me to create this podcast. And then I co-founded the Goodness Exchange. The Goodness Exchange is an amazing place on the internet now where you can enjoy unlimited access to hundreds of articles that give you a more complete, positive perspective about the state of the world. You can listen to exclusive bonus content from this podcast with our guests who are knee-deep in solving some of the world's most vexing problems, and yet they still think the future is bright. We need to know what they know. And at the Goodness Exchange, you can explore a feed of exclusively good news and recommended other kinds of content created by the Goodness Exchange community. No one with good ideas and good intentions need feel alone again. You are right to hold out hope for humanity. Millions of people are out there creating a better world, and we have created a gathering place for all that wonder. Who knows what's possible now that there's a place on the internet created to bring out our best impulses and our collective genius. To explore the home for goodness on the internet, visit goodness-exchange.com/membership. Thanks. So we're back. If you're just joining us, I'm Dr. Linda Ulrich, and you're taking a little journey with us to the Himalayas and beyond with the Conspiracy of Goodness podcast. And our wonderful guest, Shauch, who is talking to us about staying open through setbacks so we can see a world of opportunity around us. He has an amazing story of opening his heart and his mind to co-parenting a little girl and eventually her sister after what started out to be the goal of climbing a specific mountain quickly changed into a gift of expansion of what it is for his whole life. So did I bring that up decently, Mike?
That was perfect. Yeah, no, I love that. And like you said, a gift of expansion. I think that's beautiful because that's exactly what it was. It was sometimes when we open ourselves up to receiving, we can get the greatest gifts, and that allows us to expand into the depths of who we can become. But if we get too caught up in our minds with specific, expectations or specific, who I should become in life, or who I am in this life, like what my identity is, if we get caught up too much and too sort of stuck in that, I think it can kind of blind us to these little, I love that, gifts of expansion. That arise.
When you were telling me the story, the first time I went through it, I thought, how many moments in that story that first of all, moments of serendipity are pretty amazing, but you've got to be open to recognize them when they happen, right?
Totally. Yeah. And I think, spending a lot of time in nature, I think nature works like that. Nothing in nature happens randomly, right? Everything has its place. Everything happens synchronistically. You can look at, whether it's a small plant or an entire forest, it all works together collectively and with its own processes and very intelligent processes. So I think life is like that as well, where if we are open to that I'll say that intelligence of the heart, if we're open to those nuanced little synchronicities, I think they can be guiding lights to enable us, or to sort of to allow us to stay in the natural rhythm of, how life expands and blossoms, over time.
And I'm sure that has something to do with this moment when we decide what's right. What's the best course right now? Talk to me about moments where you
Yeah.
had to think that through.
Well, it's because a lot of times it's the unknown that we're talking about, right? We don't know. It's unclear. We don't have the right answer. Nobody has the right answer. And that was one of the biggest kind of challenges that Chantal and I faced when we were looking at these two little girls, in terms of their future and their education, and what is the right thing for them looking forward, working with their parents, and kind of their parents are bringing a particular lens, we're bringing a particular lens. So it's almost like these two worlds coming together and trying to figure out the best way forward. I think it's a very unique time, because maybe in some time in the future, those kind of little villages out there, maybe they won't exist anymore, right? With the whole migration to urbanization and all of that. So this is kind of a unique time where we still have these different worlds, very sort of divergent worlds, coming together in this sort of fast-paced or increasingly fast-paced world of modernization. And I remember one point where we were sitting there, Chantal and I were sitting there with Karma and her little sister Pemba, and this was several years ago now, but they were working on their homework. And Karma was, she had her computer. She was doing her computer science class, and she had this textbook that looked like it was from the 1980s. And it had like a picture of dot matrix printers and, sort of big clunky desktops and all of that. And she was memorizing, because I was like, oh, Karma, what are you doing? And she was memorizing, these are your inputs and these are your outputs. And inputs, keyboard, mouse, outputs. And I'm like, the outputs would be a printer and this and that. And I thought, this is ridiculous. Like, Karma, this is what a computer looks like. And I pulled over my MacBook. I haven't had my MacBook with me. I said, okay, let's actually use a computer and, look at how it works, right? And I was thinking, again, kids her age back in North America would be learning how to, use Google Docs and build websites and, create videos and all these things, right? Whereas she's memorizing from an 80s textbook. So, but then on the other side, I looked over at little Pemba, and she was striking, she was doing her Tibetan language course, and she was striking the most beautiful Tibetan calligraphy, just with such mindfulness and attention, patience, very artistically. And I thought, wow, okay, well, that's not something that necessarily kids are focusing on over here. So again, it's kind of those two worlds coming together again, and trying to sort of navigate the best way or the right way forward can be extremely confusing at times.
So talk to me about kind of beauty that you've seen their parents teaching them that you would have never been able to share, and vice versa.
Yeah, I mean, their parents are beautiful. Like, I have never seen such a close-knit family before. I mean, I come from a pretty good, family, and I've seen, other good families, the relations and everything, but they are so strong. And oftentimes they're not together, right? Sometimes the girls are in Kathmandu studying. Sometimes the dad's, off in the mountains with his yaks, or the mom's working long hours, or she's in a different settlement with the animals for months at a time. So, they're kind of in different places, but the connection is so strong. And we spent time many times with their father and their mother over the years, and in different parts of Nepal, and just the way he is with them. I mean, just very gentle, very, firm, but gentle, kind of very respectful all the time, very mindful, very sort of present to them. All of these things, we kind of have observed over the years. And he loves his daughter so much. In fact, one time he said to us that he was actually quite amazing. He said, he never wants them to forget their home. He never wants them to forget where they're from and their dharma. And when he because there was this point where we went back to the village and we asked them, hey, would they want them to do an exchange in Canada, for example? And he said, both parents said that they would love that, because, again, it allows them to dream bigger. But he also said that he feels like he's taken them, kind of as far as he can. And he feels like they'd be able to move faster and farther under, sort of now also with Chantal and I being there under our wings, so to speak, So, I mean, that to me was just like kind of my, like, as a parent, can you imagine saying that? I mean,
And there's so much about go that's involved in that kind of letting go.
mm.
You know, like we work very, very hard to have our sometimes. I mean, most of us do end up living lives a lot like our parents live because our parents are so set on having us, keep their values going or do what they thought we should do with our lives and all that. And I'm trying to imagine what it must be like to be these two little girls and have such a diverse set of choices and awareness about the world going on forward.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. You kind of look at the different perspectives. And for example, I remember, they said to us once they feel very grateful because they feel like they have free homes, right? They have their home in the village. They have their home in Canada with us. So they have their home at the school in Kathmandu. And then they have four parents, right? So they actually feel extremely blessed. That's another interesting point. We may kind of parachute in, anyone who visiting their village, will look at it and be like, oh, it's impoverished and, they're living off of $2, less than $2 a day. But they don't look at themselves as poor. They never, they look at the richness of, what they have. And again, I think that's a very unique sort of outlook in life to cultivate. And I think it's kind of, again, it's looking at life from a perspective of abundance, right? Versus scarcity. I think in our sort of, again, North American lens, it's very easy to look at, or we're kind of cultivated with this idea of scarcity. In order for me to win, somebody else has to lose. I got to accumulate. I got to, sort of fight for myself and my family and sort of collect as much as I can, sort of thing. Whereas the things that I started noticing over there, for example, if I contrast the education systems, here, I mean, I'm generalizing to a certain degree, but broad strokes, here was more so about the ego. There was more so about humility, cultivating that. Here was more about, what can I get? There was about what can I share? What can I give? Here was about, let's celebrate the individual. There it's like, no, let's celebrate the community. So there was kind of like these sort of very parallel or kind of opposing value systems that were being cultivated in the education systems and amongst the young people from a very young age. And I think that has a totally different, if you think about it, if you plot it out on a map, where those 2 points end up, it's very, very far from each other down the road.
Except if you've been brought up since age 3 or 7 or wherever you start with these girls to just be completely at ease with holding two things. Something I notice about our society. You're so bent on right and wrong, black and white, committing to this view and at the exclusion of everything else. We don't want to say we're wrong about anything. And gosh, I mean, I think we're probably all wrong every day. And if you're curious, you're gonna be a little bit more right every day.
Yeah,
We can get comfortable with this holding to diametrically opposed things in each hand, correct?
I think that's absolutely right. I think, we've gotten into this notion where it's very polarized, right? There's a lot of judgment floating around these days, a lot of self-judgment as well. Like you said, if you believe in one thing, it almost makes it that you're against the other thing, very black and white. So it's just, again, there's this Buddhist term about kind of softening into the middle way, finding the middle way away from both extremes, kind of embracing both sides in a way, because one side or the other, it's rare that one side's ever right and the other side is wrong all the time, right? It's just, usually there's elements of both, or we have to understand both sides of the coin. And by doing so, we kind of opened our own mindset and our own lenses to understanding why things are the way they are. And then that helps us have compassion, for perhaps the opposing view.
And then I shouldn't think we should forget that they're teaching you and Chantel all the time too, right? Like if we're thinking about being open to the wisdom of others, whether they're behind to a grasshopper or not, it's there, right? Like I love the story. Tell the story of that one day when you were rushing around getting ready to leave.
Yeah, no, yeah. I won't give too much away in the story, or in the book, but the girls did have a cultural, like an education exchange over here in Canada, which getting them here was total, small miracle in itself. But anyway, yeah, I remember one day we were kind of running around, and we were late for something, an activity or whatever it was. And I said to the girls, "Oh, girls, got to get your jackets, got to get your shoes. Come on, we got to go." And I remember little Pemba, I think she was 10 years old at that time. And she just put her hand on my arm and she said, "Mike," she said, "if we were to behave like this in my village, everybody would think that we are sick." This is not, you're absolutely right. You know what? Let's just stop and breathe and just be centered and present again. And so it's just, you just never know what. There's another time it just reminded me of as well, where we were making dinner, or I was cooking that night, and I think I was chopping vegetables or something. And yeah, little Pemba again, she came up to me and she said, she wanted to help me cook. Right. But I said, "Oh, Pemba, you don't have to help me cook today. You can just go play or do your artwork or, do whatever you want. That's okay. I got this." And she just looked at me with like these big eyes. She's like, "Why don't you want me to help you cook?" And I kind of went back into my, sort of Himalayan lens, like, oh, right. Cooking is actually part of a family, strengthening those family bonds again, right? It's not just about everybody coming down to the table. Maybe there's some scattered chatter, and maybe it's like, you sit down, you rush the meal, and then everybody leaves again. No, it's like, okay, well, it's all about in the preparation of the meal. How can we do that together? It's more of a community event, more of a family event. And then we all kind of sit down, and then we kind of appreciate the meal more, knowing that, we've all participated in creating it. And, so again, it's just a totally different way.
One of the things that you remind me of in this story is something I've been fortunate enough to become aware of at a very early age and share with my kids over and over and over again, is that money doesn't give happiness. It just gives you more choices.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
And that's what it sounds like might be a good narrative for us all when we think about doing some small kindness or some large thing like you have, is that, what if we all just tried to elevate somebody else's life so they have more choices?
I think so. Yeah. I mean, because if you think about, what we have, again, growing up in North America, in any sort of first world country, I mean, we have an abundance. If we can share some of that with others, it actually helps us. I mean, it helps them, but it actually helps us as well through that act of compassion, kindness, loving kindness. Again, not to do it from a way of, I'm up here and you're down there, nothing like that at all. It's just a matter of, okay, if there's something I can share, why wouldn't I share it? Yeah, it's just actually as simple as that.
Yeah. Okay. So there's this great story that you tell about your own life and learning through being multicultural yourself. Share with us some of that and how maybe these girls experiencing this wonderful embracing of diversity. Are they learning things going forward, going back and forth between the two cultures that are hard? Like, where does that all come into play for you guys?
Yeah, no, thanks, Linda, for bringing that up, because I think that is, an important point as well, in terms of maybe that's a factor, or probably is a factor in terms of how this has all come about. I grew up in a multicultural household. My mom's from Asia. We grew up in she immigrated to Canada, but we grew up in a small farming community, over here on the West Coast. And, at that is, again, it's changed now. But at that time, when I was a kid, I remember it was kind of like very white, very sort of, blonde hair, blue eyed. And I was the kid that stood out, right? I was one of the kids that stood out. And so I witnessed my mom experiencing very, heavy racial discrimination. I experienced it to some degree as a kid. So that kind of informs behavior and thoughts and all of that. But it's fascinating because over the years, as I'm older now, I'm kind of, people just see me as white. I guess I don't know. Like, I don't think I look that different, but and maybe I'm passing white, I guess is the term. But having been informed from a young age, kind of those racial differences, I sort of bring that same lens in when looking at what's happened with the girls as well, in terms of cultural sensitivities and all of that. Because again, the argument is about agency, right? We can help, but in helping, are we actually taking agency away from those we're trying to help? And I think that's a key question to continue to ask ourselves. Are we helping in a way that's actually empowering the person, or are we helping in a way that is actually kind of, keeping them where they are. And that's a big, I know that's a big topic these days and people are looking at it and because it's very important. So that's been one of the, in the underlying theme of this whole journey, one of the kind of sort of key thoughts has always been, yeah, we want to help, but we want to make sure we're doing it in the best or in the right way. That's not sort of disempowering them at the same time. It's actually, empowering them.
Good intention counts for a whole lot, but mistakes are made a lot of times cross-culturally because we're not pausing to think about what's going to happen with this choice or that choice from the 100,000-foot look.
Right. Yeah. And it's tough, right? Because again, we don't know. We're just trying to do the best thing. So it's a learning experience for everybody, right? I mean, if everyone knew the answers or the right way, then obviously we wouldn't be having this conversation. But it is there are a lot of unknowns. And again, it's all these cultures that are coming together and the cultures are changing. And again, the speed of which the world is modernizing is changing things at a rapid pace as well. So, I mean, even if we didn't go in there in that village, they would still have access to the internet. They would still be influenced by the outside world. They'd still be, bringing on those values to a degree. So it's just like, we cannot slow down really where the world is heading from that perspective, but can we help cultural preservation so that the people who are sort of being wrapped into this rapidly modernizing world can do it in a way where they retain, autonomy and their own cultural values?
That's lovely. That's the goal for an awful lot of people doing good in the world, is keeping things moving forward with people's sense of identity and making the best of a growing, changing, interconnected world. And it's just finding that sweet spot.
Exactly. And it's tricky. It is very tricky and it's very sensitive. But I think it goes back to the beginning of our conversation, right? And that sign that you've got there to be a good global citizen. What does that mean to be a good global citizen? Well, it means really taking our blinders down. It means letting our guard down, being vulnerable, understanding that we do not know the right way all the time, or even half the time, that we have to learn from others and we have to sort of, soften into the cultural values and kind of the different worldviews that exist out there. And can we work with, how can we work with those and how can we empower them so that we can learn from them as well?
Lovely. There's a lot to be said in your story about, I'm sure, being graceful, gravitating towards that word a lot, gravitating towards who being graceful. That doesn't mean they don't tackle the hard thing. It just means they're thoughtful and they're measured in their approach. So as we wrap up here with your life's journey, as we all have experienced, there are certain things that we wish the world knew. I believe that every single human being I meet has a story. Usually if I have the time to sit with anybody, I'm one of those people that goes to a party and finds one person across a crowded room that I just have to learn more about, and I'll talk all night to them. And I've never found a person have a story compelling and cool and full of twists and turns. So what do you really wish people do? Something that comes from your life's journey?
Well, I would say, maybe one of the biggest lessons I learned from the girls is just to not get too caught up in our own expectations of ourselves and of, others, whether it's a spouse or a child or whoever, because everybody, as you say, everybody's on their own journey. Everybody's their own person. They're on their own journey. And the best thing we can actually do is to support each other in those journeys.
Well, this lovely book is, and I do have to ask you one last question about a great review. I'd love to travel, and I know so many of us have stuck at home for what amounts to more than 2 years now. One of the reviews went on, it was by Susan Miller from the Portland Review. And she said, a story of karma is heartwarming and touching tale about fate and what happens when you let go and follow your heart into the unknown. And for most of us prevented from traveling by COVID, this book made me feel like I'd been on almost to the end of the earth. That is a lovely sentence.
Yeah.
You consider yourself a travel writer, right? Is this book for folks who they want a bit of adventure, even though we're still stuck at home in a way?
Yeah, I think so. It definitely will take you on a journey to probably a world that's, kind of maybe a new world, but it also, it's a love story as well. And, kind of a love story across continents and cultures and, and where that ends up.
Well, ugh, lovely. Absolutely lovely. Thanks so much for sharing your time with us today.
Thank you so much, Linda, for having me. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Okay, well, my hope is that you'll dive into this book, A Story of Karma, and you'll find Mike Schauch's words of wisdom throughout the book that we couldn't possibly cover all right here to help you along in your own journey. We're all trying to make sense of the world we find in front of us. The goodness exchange that we've been referring you to this podcast, where we have a collection of about 1,000 articles about people like Mike who are changing the future for us all and others, is a great peace of mind place. If you just want to know that the world is still amazing, or if you want to find your role in it, either way, I hope that all the connections Mike and I have shared with you today help you a life that feels well lived every night when you put your head on the. Thanks so much, Mike.
Thank you, Linda.
Have a great day.
You too.